Welcome to Macro Hive Conversations with Bilal Hafiz. We aim to bring you the best macro analysis to help you successfully invest in financial markets. For our latest analysis, visit macrohive.com. We have a special occasion to celebrate. This is our 100th episode of Macro Hive Conversations. We launched our first episode just as COVID was breaking out in March 2020, and almost 2 years later, we're at episode 100. Unfortunately, COVID is still with us, but hopefully it won't be by the time we get to episode 200. And I wanted to thank the hundreds of thousands of people that have listened to the podcast and helped spread the word. It's very gratifying to me that the hard work of producing a high-quality weekly macro podcast show has paid off. As a show of thanks, we have a gift for all of our listeners. We're offering a special discount of $1 or £1 for 8 weeks for full membership to Macro Hive. You just need to go to macrohive.com/100podcast. That's macrohive.com/100podcast. The 100 is written as a number. With membership, you get access to transcripts to all of the podcasts, as well as our exclusive investor research on equities, crypto, and macro. You'll also get access to our member Slack room, where you can interact with the Macro Hive research team and other members all hours of the day. Once again, you can get a special discount of $1 or £1 for 8 weeks at macrohive.com/100podcast. Now, onto this episode's guest, Greg Zuckerman. Greg is a special writer at the Wall Street Journal. He's the author of A Shot to Save the World, the inside story of the life or death race for a COVID-19 vaccine. The book has been optioned by HBO for a series from Academy Award-winning director Adam McKay. Greg is also author of the bestseller, The Man Who Solved the Market, How Jim Simons Launched a Quant Revolution. Now, onto my interview. So greetings, Greg. It's great to have you on the podcast. We've been in conversation for a while now, and it's great to have an excuse to finally have you as a podcast guest.
It's a pleasure. I'm a fan. You have one of the more thoughtful and eclectic podcasts out there. So I've listened for a while. So it's a pleasure to actually be a guest.
That's great. And this comes as you've just published this excellent new book called A Shot to Save the World, which is about the COVID vaccine, the race to create it, the personalities behind it all, which we'll talk about in our conversation. We'll also talk about your book before that, The Man Who Solved the Market, about Jim Simons and his performance and track record, which you kind of delved into. But before we go into all of that, it'd be great to get your origin story. Where did you go to university? Was it inevitable you're going to journalism and sort of finance as a focus within that? What's your story?
Sure. I never dreamed, frankly, of being a journalist growing up. I grew up in Providence, Rhode Island, the son of an academic, and my mother sold life insurance. Early on, I was enthralled by the markets. My parents didn't know much about it, but it just intrigued me. As a kid in camp, I was trading stocks. I lost all the money, the little money I got from my bar mitzvah playing the market. I was very impressed by, there was a book I read about low PE stocks by a guy named Ray Jerks, who had some notoriety at one point. And so I bought low PE stocks. It took me a little while to realize sometimes there's a reason why stocks are trading at low PE ratios. But I was literally having my counselors in camp bringing me back. I remember Barron's magazine on their days off. And I was cutting out between periods to call a broker to make trades as a kid. I remember just being amazed, even younger, at the back of a Skippy peanut butter jar when I realized that there wasn't a Skippy corporation. It was like Procter & Gamble, somebody, they also owned maybe some jelly. I'm like, wait, hold on a second. They're brands and they're companies and they make money. And I just found the whole thing fascinating. So I always figured I'd go work on Wall Street. I went to a Brandeis University, a liberal arts school outside Boston. I did well. I majored in political science and took some economics. My father had taught political science, so that was a little bit in the blood. And I figured I did well in school. I'd go work on Wall Street after I graduated. And I graduated and took some time traveling in Europe, got to New York, I guess it was 1990 or so. 1989, and I could not get a job. I didn't even get an interview. So part of the problem was I hadn't done any sort of internships and worked on the side. I always worked in camps. I like playing ball and being with kids. And I figured, hey, I did well in school. I'll get a job on Wall Street. And no, I knew no one. I didn't have any experience. It was a bad time. There were the reverberations of 1987, and there wasn't much hiring going on at the time. So I couldn't get a job. And I worked, the closest I could get was working on conferences, banking conferences. So I did that for a little bit, and I got fired twice from those jobs. I wasn't very good at it. My heart wasn't into it. I was like writing on the side and doing things in the middle of the day. And I remember being fired, and this woman, a veteran, walked me down the stairs, and it was one of those kind of stereotypic cliched scenes where I had like a box of all my stuff, and I was feeling down, down and out. I didn't love my job, but no one likes to be fired as a young person or any time. And she said, Greg, you're going to look at this as the best day of your life someday. Look, you can look back on it. And she was so right, because had I been pretty good at that job instead of awful, I would have, stayed and got married and mortgage and all that kind of stuff. But instead, I got fired, and it forced me to figure out what I wanted to do. And I spent a few years with some entrepreneurial job opportunities. I started a business. I took kids on college tours around America, and I started a newsletter or two. But then one day, I saw an ad in the newspaper. Back then, there were jobs available for people in newspapers, and it was to be a reporter, to be a financial reporter. And I went in there, and they gave me a quote unquote leaked document. It was like a merger between Citibank and somebody else. And you're supposed to write about the document and interview a source, and the source is the editor. And I had no clips. I'd never thought about journalism, being a newspaper reporter. And I remember sitting there taking this test saying, wait, they're going to pay me to write about Wall Street? I loved Wall Street. I love newspapers. I loved them. And I'm like, this is what I should be doing. This is it. So I stumbled into this career.
And then you've ended up at the Wall Street Journal. I mean, one of the top, probably, one of the top financial, newspapers.
Yeah. So I started this little newsletter and broke some stories, and it just came, frankly, this is what I should be doing. Like, there are a million jobs out there I'd be awful at, but this is what I'm natural at. I love talking to people about business and finance, and it's genuine interest on my part. So a lot of people, I think, in my world, frankly, go into financial journalism because there's a job opportunity. They want to be reporters. They're really smart, good writers, but they're not into business. They're not into finance and in trading and investing. And I love this stuff. So I think that gives me an advantage. And I worked on my writing. My writing wasn't very good early on. And I was writing like an academic, and I was doing a pyramid, which means you do a little, like in the world of academia, you're in school, you have a nice little thesis at the beginning of my pieces, and then you should see my conclusions at the end. They were amazing. But my editor's like, no, Greg, in journalism, we do the reverse pyramid. No one's reading till the end of the stories, or not everyone. So you got to hit them hard up high. So I had to learn that whole thing. And I just started reading Barbarians, the Gate, Liar's Poker, Den of Thieves, all the classics. And I just threw myself into learning journalism. And I broke some stories at this little newsletter. I went to the New York Post for a little while, and that was a blast. And then I got to the Wall Street Journal. I got an opportunity to write about the bond market. And frankly, I turned it down. I was like, I didn't know much about the bond market. I wasn't interested in bonds. I was more of an equities guy. And I got back to my office at the New York Post, and they say, Greg, the Journal may never call again. Take the bond job. So that was my first job. I started covering the bond market. I went to the Heard on the Street column, did that for a number of years, wrote about hedge funds, private equity. And now I'm an investigative reporter, kind of running after different stories around the world.
I mean, that's great. And now you've just published this book, or perhaps it doesn't feel like just to you, but it's kind of out in the world finally, Shot to Save the World. What was your motivation for tackling this? Because it's not finance related, which is what you've done in earlier books. Why this? Why do you think you had a story to tell here?
So I was locked down like everybody else in this world, early summer of 2020. And it was a very discouraging time for us all. And I kept hearing about these efforts to build a vaccine. And what struck me is that it shouldn't have been these companies and these efforts. Who was in the lead? It was the University of Oxford. It was Moderna. It was BioNTech. These are efforts, companies, academic groups that had never produced anything in their history. We're talking decades of work, no vaccines, no drugs, nothing approved. And yet they were the ones in the lead. And where were the leaders? Where were the experts? Where were the people you would have expected? Where was Merck? Where was GSK? Where was Sanofi? I mean, Merck is the vaccine leader. They're the ones who developed the measles, mumps, and rubella vaccine that we rely on all over the world. And yet they were not in the lead. So I loved that theme, the unlikely heroes theme, which frankly is I don't consciously do it, but I'm sure on some level I pursue these kind of stories. It's in all my books. So the first book I did is called The Greatest Trade Ever. It's about John Paulson. Why was John Paulson the one to make $20 billion from the financial meltdown in 2008? He was a merger arb. He knew nothing about mortgages. I did a book called The Frackers about all the oil and gas that was discovered, the fracking revolution. It wasn't BP and it wasn't Chevron, it wasn't Exxon. Exxon was literally sitting on top of ground zero for this revolution, and yet they were anywhere but America. It was a bunch of unlikely characters. Same thing with the man who solved the market. So there was that theme there with the vaccine chase. Well, Moderna, not only had they never done anything historically, there were suspicions about them. Stefan Bancel, the CEO, was compared to Elizabeth Holmes. So I just love that theme, and I threw myself into it.
Yeah. I mean, that's something I didn't realize until I read your book about how Moderna and BioNTech, they hadn't produced vaccines before. I mean, that was a real surprise. And why do you think this was the case, that it was these outsiders that created it? I mean, COVID obviously was a big deal for the world, and there's these massive pharma companies.
Yeah, it's a good question. The first answer I'll give is that until 2020, vaccines were seen as kind of a loser business. It's hard to imagine today because Pfizer is going to make $50 billion from their COVID vaccine. I think it's going to be the biggest selling drug or vaccine in the world. But until this pandemic, most people in the pharma business saw vaccines as, I wouldn't say a waste of time, but a frustrating process. You spend years on a vaccine. Maybe it works, but even if it does, by then maybe the pandemic, maybe the illness has gone away, the disease has gone away. If you think about the earlier coronaviruses, MERS, SARS, you think about Zika, you think about others, for a while they're lethal and they're troubling, they're scary, but then they go away, they dissipate, they peter out. And you spend all this time, this money chasing a vaccine when sometimes it's not even necessary by the time, if you succeed. And then even if you do succeed, how often can you give a vaccine? Once a lifetime, sometimes every few years. It's not like a statin. I take a statin every day. I'm paid for it all the time. I just went to the CVS yesterday. So in general, vaccines are not seen as very sexy business until recently by Big Pharma. That's part of it. And part of it also is these companies, let's say Merck. So I write in my book about a rift internally at Merck and how some scientists said in early 2020, we should be the ones to step up. We are Merck. We're the vaccine giants. We've produced all these previous vaccines. Why don't we step up and save the world? And others kind of said, well, we don't want to get distracted. We've got this franchise, this cancer franchise that's booming. We've got other things we're pursuing. What if this doesn't turn into a pandemic? I would argue that BioNTech and Moderna and Novavax had less to lose. These companies didn't have existing drugs to distract them and successful efforts. So in some ways they had less to lose and were able to throw everything at this new virus and develop a vaccine.
It's a bit like the innovator's dilemma, I suppose. Why disrupt your own business? But one thing I noticed in your book, you spent a bit of time talking about vaccines from an earlier period, and to provide the overall context, because I suspect you were addressing the issue that a lot of people were skeptical towards the vaccines because it felt like it was just an overnight invention of some kind. But you made very clear that there's been a long history of vaccine development. In some ways, everyone's standing on the shoulder of giants and so on. There's a history here. Do you want to kind of talk through about, a potted history of sort of vaccine development, perhaps?
Yes, and I did that consciously, right? So I started off with a chase for an HIV vaccine, partly because I want the reader to be a little bit surprised picking up the book, but partly it's because it's very it reflects a theme that I think is really important. That, as you suggest, there's a long process involved, and Sometimes you go down a road in terms of science, and it leads to nowhere. As an outsider, I was talking to people about COVID-19 vaccines. They kept talking about HIV. I was like, wait, HIV? We still don't have a vaccine for HIV. No, Greg. We've learned so much along the way. And then they would list them and how to conduct trials. We learned about the immune system. We learned about just the spike protein. Spike protein, there was a spike protein that everyone chased for HIV. It didn't work out. It was the best method to approach a vaccine, to develop a vaccine for HIV. It didn't work out. HIV is just so much more challenging. It changes within people from person to person. It attacks our immune system. There are all kinds of reasons why HIV is much more challenging than this coronavirus, but there are a lot of similarities, and we learned lessons in this adenovirus approach. Which eventually led to both the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine, but also the J&J vaccine that was developed by Merck and others in the chase for an HIV vaccine. So for all those reasons, I thought it's important to go back in history and teach a little bit about how vaccines are developed, what are vaccines, just that they're an education for the immune system, so that if it encounters a piece of a virus or a protein of a virus or creates inside you something that looks similar to the virus, then it knows to fight it off in the future. So I go back in history for those reasons, but I also do it for I want to plant a seed in the reader, in that you readers should realize how difficult it is to produce an effective vaccine. So yes, these COVID-19 vaccines are remarkable. They're I would argue modern science's greatest achievement, but we were very lucky. We should be very grateful and appreciative, because there've been so many failures in the past. And that's kind of why I start with HIV as well, because it was a failure, and it should make us appreciate that much more so these vaccines, these COVID vaccines.
And why do you think the vaccine was developed so quickly, this COVID vaccine?
So I'll give you two reasons. Partly it's because of the years of work that I write about, go back in history. So mRNA, and we can talk about a little bit, but that there's years of work that went into that, going into 2020, the adenovirus approach. Again, that's Astra and that's J&J. There was years of work. But the other answer is, for the first time in history, we did things simultaneously. And what I mean by that is we developed, we tested, and we manufactured a vaccine for the first time simultaneously at the same time. And why? Why didn't we in the past ever do that? Well, it's just too expensive. Why would you spend billions and millions of dollars to manufacture, to test, and then manufacture a vaccine before it's approved? Why would you build a vaccine before it's approved? It's just a waste of money. So no one ever did that historically. And the reason we did it last year was partly, we're in the middle of a pandemic, but partly there was money for that. There was money from investors, there was money from venture capital, et cetera, but also from governments around the world, especially Operation Warp Speed in the United States. So Moderna, and I could talk about it, but Moderna built their vaccine, as did others, before they were sure it was even going to work. And again, the only reason they could do that is the government and others were handing out checks. So that should be reassuring for people. Yes, it was done in 330 days from the sequencing to the authorization, which is just ridiculous. Historically, the fastest ever was mumps at 4 years, and the average vaccine 10 years. So 330 days is just a joke. But the reason why people shouldn't be concerned is that they didn't cut corners. They just did things simultaneously for the first time ever.
And so let's talk about some of the players. You mentioned Moderna there, you've mentioned Oxford. Who were some of the players, and what types of vaccines were they working on? Perhaps you could explain the nature of some of these vaccines, mRNA, viral vectors, and so on.
Sure. So Moderna is one that I emphasize in the book for a lot of reasons. They're just a fascinating, interesting, groundbreaking company, started in Cambridge, Massachusetts, 2010. And they were dedicated to using messenger RNA. I guess I should spend just a couple moments talking about what this thing is. So messenger RNA is a molecule. We all have it inside of us. It delivers messages within the cell from the DNA, which to the part of the cell where proteins are created. DNA can't do it itself. It relies on mRNA molecules to deliver the message to part of the cell. And then these proteins are created that keep us alive. So in other words, mRNA are these crucial molecules that deliver instructions within the body. And scientists always said, well, wow, what if we could create mRNA in the lab synthetically? Just sort of like we have natural sugar. Sugar exists in nature, but there's also in the world, but we can create it in the lab as well, synthetic sugar. Same kind of thing. We can create synthetic molecules. And what would be the reason why they get all excited about it? Well, then if you could create these mRNA molecules in the laboratory, then you can send any message to the body to create any kind of protein and therefore create any kind of drug or vaccine, and you're off to the races. So that was sort of the holy grail for scientists for years, for decades. And most of them, just as quickly as they got excited about the idea of creating messenger RNA, they kind of gave up on the idea because mRNA gets chopped up almost immediately in the body and eliminated. Some vaccine hesitant people say, well, I don't want mRNA in my body. It's going to change my DNA. No, it gets chopped up and eliminated. And that's kind of why no one wanted to ever work with this thing. There are other reasons as well. The body's immune system fends it off. So yeah, people got excited about mRNA, but most people, the conventional wisdom within the world of science was don't waste your time on mRNA. But people persisted, and there are scientists I write about, I can talk about, who spent years making steady progress. It's a little bit like a relay race where they would run a lap or two and have good time, and then they would stumble and fall and sort of pass the baton to somebody else. And Moderna, again, in 2010, they were a startup and they threw themselves into developing drugs really based on mRNA. And they were originally called Moderna Therapeutics. And they spent years on it and they met frustration after frustration. And this guy, Stéphane Bancel, the CEO, was a very hard-charging, difficult CEO. People had a tough time pleasing him, keeping up with him. They early on were collapsing in the office and in the car, in the parking lot, hitting their heads at home and being rushed to the hospital, and he would fire people left and right. But he was inspirational at the same time. He had a vision. He said, we believe in mRNA. We are going to be the ones someday to save the world, to step up in a crisis. And those who survived working there early on were inspired by him. And they, by the end of 2019, on the eve of this pandemic, we're, I would say, the subject of a lot of skepticism, if not worse, maybe even accusations within the world, the biotech world, because they hadn't proven anything. They'd given up on drugs. They'd shifted to vaccines. They weren't very transparent. They had raised billions and billions of dollars without any proof of concept. And some people accused Bancel of being Elizabeth Holmes-like, in that, well, he wore black turtlenecks. That was part of the similarity. He raised a ton of money, and often from sort of outsider type people, not biotech specialists, and that raised suspicions within the biotech world. But also just he's a showman in some ways. He's an outgoing guy. He's not a scientist. He's a Harvard MBA. He's an engineer. And here he was saying, oh yeah, we're going to be the ones to save things. Well, really, Stefan, what have you done so far? They were saying by early 2020, the stock was down off about 15% from the IPO price. And yet in early 2020, Bancel and his colleagues said, we got to be the ones to step up. It's a very unlikely story.
Wow. And then obviously, they ended up creating the vaccine. So, all of that hard work was for something. And what about other groups of companies involved in this? You mentioned Oxford, for example.
Yeah.
I mean, what were they doing?
Yeah. So Oxford, it was led by Adrian Hill, who's a character, to say the least, within the world of science. He's a senior scientist there, an academic, and he has spent his life dedicated to a vaccine for malaria. But he worked on other vaccines as well, for other illnesses, other diseases. And for decades, we're talking years and years, he and his colleagues had tried to develop vaccines and hadn't succeeded. And yet, Hill is notorious within the world of science, probably the most detested, unliked scientist, at least that I can identify. because despite his own lack of apparent success by end of 2019, early 2020, he was very difficult on others within the industry. In other words, he would get up in meetings and rip into other people's approaches. That's not going to work. Why do you think that way? That's a foolish approach. Things like that, which, academics can be tough on each other, but few were as difficult and hard as Adrian Hill. Very self-confident in his approach. And he was using something called the adenovirus approach, which was developed earlier in history using, and that was by Merck. And I talked about HIV. They're the ones who originated it, and they failed and gave up, and it was an embarrassment, and they actually harmed people, and they shuttered that whole effort. Merck did in terms of HIV, but a couple other people said, well, maybe we can improve on what they've done, and that was one of them was Adrian Hill and his colleagues at the University of Oxford. And adenovirus approach, as opposed to mRNA. mRNA, you're sending a message basically with mRNA to the body to create a protein. And obviously, in this case, the protein is the spike protein. What you're doing is telling the body to create the spike protein. Why? Because you're educating the body so that the next time, if it ever encounters the spike protein for real with the actual virus, it will know, I've been taught by that vaccine. I've been taught that it's something I should be fighting off. It's foreign. It's something harmful, and then you go fight it off. So the mRNA sends a message to the body to create the protein, and then that's how they protect. That's why it's protective vaccine. The adenovirus approach, which is the one that Adrian Hill in Oxford, and also Johnson and Johnson in the United States and elsewhere, they use that approach. They create same idea. You create the spike protein, but they do it through a virus. You're actually in the case of University of Oxford and AstraZeneca, it's a chimpanzee virus. You're using that as a courier into the body, and the logic there being that viruses, their job is to kind of spread and get within the body, and so if you can use a virus to get inside the body and send a genetic message, it's the same idea. You have the body create. The message is to create the spike protein. If you can have the body create the spike protein, then you've taught the body, you've educated the body, and taught the immune system to fight off this virus in the future. It's just that the University of Oxford Astra approach is to do that as opposed to with mRNA molecule. You do it through this chimpanzee virus, and it's one obviously that's harmless. That's been rendered harmless. You can play with it in the lab and change the genetic makeup of the virus such that it's not harmful. So Adrian Hill, they were in the lead for a long time. In 2020, there was an assumption in the labs at places like Moderna and BioNTech that University of Oxford would be the winner. And I write about sort of the internal pressures there and how they lost the lead. But in the end, it was an effective vaccine. It's just not quite as effective as the mRNA ones, the BioNTech Pfizer one and the Moderna one.
And the BioNTech team that you've mentioned, they seem to be the highest profile in terms of like personalities. The scientists, Sahin and Torechi. What were your findings around them, and what was their approach? Yeah,
they're fascinating characters in their own right. Aslam Turki and her husband Ugur Sahin. They're immigrants from Turkey, moved to Germany, started this company BioNTech. And their focus was cancer. So they spent years building cancer vaccines and potentially drugs using different approaches. But what's fascinating is that they weren't infectious disease experts. And yet, on the eve of this pandemic in 2020, they're having breakfast in Mainz, an outdoor cafe I write about. And they started talking about this new virus that was spreading. They had read about it in the Lancet report. And what struck them, especially Ugur Sahin, was that there was asymptomatic spread of this disease. And he said to himself, wait, hold on a second. We had these earlier coronaviruses and they were pretty dangerous and lethal, but why did they not spread the world? Because we could isolate those infected. But if you're telling me that there's a family that had visited Wuhan and they brought back this virus back home, and they didn't know who was symptomatic and who wasn't, then it's going to be impossible to isolate people. And actually, by now, this is in January 2020. He's saying by now, I'm sure this is spreading the world. He looked into it, and Wuhan's an enormous city. It's bigger than the U.S. cities of Chicago and New York combined. And he said, wait, hold on a second. There are flights going everywhere. This thing is spreading the world. And we're not sure. We've never developed a vaccine, never developed a drug, but we've got this approach using mRNA that we think can work. So let's throw ourselves into developing this vaccine. And to their credit, like, I don't know about you and your audience, but in January 2020, I was literally walking through Heathrow without a mask. I think I tried putting one on. People gave me a look, and I took it off. And most people were kind of not conscious, or at least not focused on this virus. And Ugur Sahin was scared to death and worried about the future. And he said, we're going to be the ones to step up. So to their credit, they threw themselves into this thing, and they convinced Pfizer to work with them. And it wasn't easy. In hindsight, we need to be a little more appreciative of this vaccine, because for various reasons, but among them is Ugur Sahin first talked to a senior scientist at Pfizer, Phil Dormitzer, and Dormitzer said, I don't think we want to work together on this thing. Who knows if this virus is going to go away? We've got so much else going on. We're working on a flu vaccine. And to his credit, Ugur Sahin persisted, and he convinced another senior scientist, Catherine Jansen, to work together, and the rest is history. But we need to be appreciative of their efforts.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that sort of strikes me in you sort of describing all of these efforts are just how kind of unexpected some of these developments were. People working on one thing, and then they pivot towards this, and they face some opposition, and they overcome it. So, I mean, it really is, something of the movies about this all.
I hope so. Yes. Yes, there was a drama there, and it's very unexpected. Right. And again, I don't think we appreciate the good fortune we've had this virus arisen in 2006, 2017, earlier. It likely would have been years of waiting for a vaccine. And now we kind of have the luxury of debating whether we should have a third shot or even a fourth. Now we're starting to talk about maybe, at least in the West. Obviously, in other parts of the world, we're not as fortunate. But we have the luxury of debating whether, we're overdoing it with the vaccines, if there is a segment of the population that resist the vaccines. Well, it wasn't a foregone conclusion that we would have these vaccines, or that they would be nearly as effective. Even the people within these labs and these companies that I talked to leading up to the November 2020 data that proved how effective they were nervous. They weren't sure. They were thinking maybe 60% effective. They would take it. That'd be fine. You think about the flu vaccine, it's about 50, 40, 50, 60% effective each year. So to your point, there was a lot of unexpected turns that we need to be appreciative of.
And you also mentioned Novavax as well in your book. I mean, what was the story behind them?
Yeah, I love the Novavax story, partly because it teaches me a lesson. So I'm an outsider to the world of science. I'm oriented to the financial markets. So when I see a stock like Novavax in January 2020, that was trading at like $3 a share. And we all know them, like, right, Bilal? We all know these biotechs that have been promising for years and failing after failing. And frankly, as a journalist, I generally dismiss them. The market's pretty efficient. If stock's trading at 3, I kind of figure, all right, I'm not going to waste too much time. And and that was what was happening at Novavax. They were running out of money. They only had a few months left of cash. They were going to have to close down. They had failed at everything. Name a virus or some kind of illness, disease they had tried to develop. I mean, I'm exaggerating a little bit, but maybe a half dozen, maybe more different vaccines that hadn't worked. But the lesson for me, at least, is that there are a lot of dreamers out there, and Greg, don't dismiss them. And there were dreamers at Novavax, and they would argue, and I think rightly, that they were making progress. And the market didn't appreciate it. And they know concrete examples, but they were improving their approach. And their approach is called the protein subunit approach, which is a little bit more traditional. Basically, you create the key protein of a virus in the laboratory, and then you figure out a way to get it into the body. And they had an approach that they believed in. And to their credit, there are all these dreamers out there, both in the world of biotech, but elsewhere. And I've learned a lesson not to dismiss them. It's not to say that every dreamer is going to succeed, but I don't know. There's this guy, George Mitchell, in the United States, who believed in attacking this and drilling from this formation called shale. And everyone thought he was a fool. It's too far down. It's too expensive. Don't waste your time. And he was right, and they were wrong. I don't know. Jim Simons believed in the quantitative approach, and most people didn't at the time, and they dismissed him and what he was doing. So I've learned to at least take a coffee, hear out the dreamers, see what they're thinking about, and that's why I write about Novavax, and they have developed a very effective vaccine. Now, they're a small, tiny company. No one would work with them, unlike Pfizer and BioNTech, et cetera. So it's been difficult for them to manufacture their vaccine. And I do think eventually, in the next year or so, it will be approved. There are some places in Asia that actually have started to use that vaccine. I think it's going to be imported in places like Africa and elsewhere, because it doesn't have to be kept at cold temperatures like the mRNA ones. And it's a very effective one. But there are lessons just to me, at least, as a journalist and to investors as well, I think.
And then you mentioned manufacturing there. I mean, how important was the manufacturing distribution side of things? I mean, how did that all come about so quickly?
Yeah, it came out quickly because people worked 24/7 and destroyed themselves. And I've talked to some of these people within the manufacturing efforts at some of these companies. And I know there's someone I'm thinking of at stage 4 cancer, and she kept coming in. There's this gentleman who runs manufacturing at Moderna named Juan Andres, who I just find just kind of fascinating, because he's not a scientist, but he got nervous about the pandemic early on. And he told his family, and he started stocking up on tissue paper and toilet paper and food. He bought a third refrigerator for his basement, and his family thought he was crazy. He was nuts. They were rolling their eyes. And then this is like February, even January, maybe, of 2020. But by March of 2020, his mother-in-law had died of COVID, and the family and like the rest of us were sufficiently scared about it. So Juan Andres is just a fascinating individual, and he runs Moderna's manufacturing. And listen, they frankly are frustrated because they've gone all out over the past year, and they've developed these effective vaccines, and yet there's a segment of the population that won't take them, and there's also a segment of the population that points the finger and accuses them of certain things, of either harming people or being focused on money. So I feel for them, and they've gone through this emotional roller coaster, and they're exhausted, they're physically drained, they're emotionally drained, and they did it because they just went all out. And it's a very difficult process. To your question, the manufacturing side and the distribution, there were mistakes made, but it was a pandemic. They were making decisions on the fly.
And after all of this, I mean, you talked about all these developments in mRNA and all of these acceleration of sort of research that's happened. I mean, what's your sense of the future of vaccines? I mean, obviously that's a big topic, but I mean, outside of dealing with COVID, I mean, what other things do you think we'll see? I mean, will there be something for cancer, for example, or something like that?
So I'm a financial journalist, so I'm inherently a little skeptical, maybe too much so. So I go into this saying, well, yeah, they've succeeded with COVID, but there's never been any success with using mRNA or the adenovirus approach. I guess the adenovirus maybe it has made more progress, some other viruses and illnesses, but we haven't really seen anything with cancer yet that to get excited about. So I'm a little bit skeptical, but I'm also very hopeful. As you know, and your audience knows, when there's been success and there's been money made, then talent and other resources suddenly flock to that area. So the best and brightest are now backing mRNA approaches to different things, and they're throwing themselves into new efforts. And from talking to these executives and these researchers, Ugur Sahin and others, I know that they're not slowing down. They're going all out to go back to their original passions. So Ugur Sahin and Azam Turki wanted to create a vaccine for cancer. They're back at it, and they've got money now, they've got resources, they've got talent. And the Moderna folks are focusing on things like RSV, which is a virus that kills children and it kills elderly. CMV, another virus. Others are taking on AIDS and Adrian Hill, malaria. So I again, going back to my point with Novavax, you don't want to be too skeptical, people like myself. And I want to give, I'm going to be hopeful. I'm going to be optimistic that they're going to prove it to us again. And they are, the thing about this biotech world that I've learned is just they're resilient, they're persistent, they're creative. Everyone focuses on Silicon Valley and innovation in the tech world. Well, the biotech world is just as impressive, if not more impressive. So I want to, I'm going to hold out hope and that they're going to amaze us in the next years.
No, that's great. And I definitely urge all our listeners to get hold of your book, A Shot to Save the World. Now, given our audience, a lot of them are financial people, I have to ask you about your previous book, The Man Who Solved the Market, an excellent book. I really enjoyed reading it. It's about Jim Simons. And perhaps you could just talk, a bit about him and what made him so special, and why you wrote that book.
Yeah. So Jim Simons is the greatest, I don't know what you call him, investor? Do you call him an investor, speculator, moneymaker, I guess, that the world of finance has ever seen. The returns are ridiculous for those who aren't aware. The Medallion Fund, his key hedge funds, 66% a year for decades. And that's before fees, but that's a ridiculous return. Even last year, they were up, I believe it was 49% in 2021. So, and they're the original quants. They are the pioneers. This approach obviously has swept Wall Street, but swept broader society of predictive algorithms, Netflix and Facebook, et cetera, that govern our lives. And these guys were doing predictive algorithms, building them decades ago. We're talking the 80s, early 80s, that kind of thing. I wrote, and they're also the most secretive firm in history. It was a very difficult process writing that book, getting people to open up. Still not sure why they talked to me. So to your question, what makes Jim Simons different? I'll give you an answer. The answer is, he is both a scientist. He's a groundbreaking mathematician. He is one of the greatest geometers of our times. And so he knows the world of quantitative research, building algorithms, et cetera. But he's also a guy that you'd want to have a beer with, or in his case, a gin and tonic. He's a chain smoker. He's a funny guy. And he understands people, motivations. He can recruit better than anyone I've ever seen. He'll say, just come on over, work for a day, spend the week with us, give a lecture. You might find it challenging. He knows what makes people tick. And he built a very, very unique culture. So I would argue, there are a lot of there's smart quants there, but there are a lot of smart quantitative firms, et cetera. But they've got a very unique culture in that it's very flat. Everybody knows what everyone else is working on. It's an open architecture. There's one fund, the Medallion Fund. They've got a couple others that are outside funds, but the key Medallion funds, everyone works together. They're not hierarchical. It's very unique. Everyone knows the secrets. Anyone can see look at the secret sauce. It's an amazing thing. And then you say to yourself, well, why doesn't the secret leak out then? Well, part of it was the beauty of what he's done. And it wasn't conscious. It was serendipity, as he's an academic who was an academic, and he really only hires academics. And those academics are not going to go work for Goldman or start a hedge fund. They'll go back to academia after they're done over there. And they make so much money, they don't need to go work for another firm. So it's a remarkably unique. Internally, everyone shares information, and there aren't silos. I mean, you know as well as anyone else that one of the key hallmarks of many Wall Street firms is their silos, and there are good reasons for these silos. She does really well this year. She makes a lot of money. Let's give her a team. Let's give her a fund, et cetera. And that does not happen at Renaissance. They just work together, unlike most other firms I've ever seen.
That's great. In fact, I mean, based on your book and also some of the writing I've seen on them, I really did find the culture that they've built there very inspirational. And I always like this whole idea of kind of open architecture ways of doing things. And that's something hopefully we've tried to do at MacroHive as well. And what I did find working at banks is that they kind of work on the opposite side. So if you're open architecture minded inside of a bank, everything is just pushing you against that to be siloed. And so you're always kind of swimming against the tide. And what I found is since leaving big banks and working outside, it's just so much easier to create that environment. And I guess there's a path dependence in banks, and cultures just form and people get used to that, and they think that's the only way to do things. And they stay sort of doing that. Because the question I've always thought is, okay, people should know that's what Rentech does. Why don't they recreate it? But I just think a lot of people just are so used to a different way of running things that they find it hard to replicate that.
That's fascinating. I didn't realize. Yeah, that's the instinct within the bank, just to fight that open architecture and prevent that from happening. And I know that's the case at quant firms. I'm thinking of one in particular. I know a senior person there. They're very good quant firm, but he said, Greg, we would love to operate like Simon's. Well, not Simon doesn't run things anymore, but like Renaissance does, and we just can't. Like you said, cultures evolve, and maybe if they started scratch, they would. But at this point, it's too late.
Yeah. Well, I did also want to ask some personal questions as well, Greg. One, given that you're in the world of finance, you've researched, you've investigated a lot of great sort of firms and so on. What's the best investment advice you've ever received?
Well, I'll give you just some observations from my reporting. I'm not sure I wish I'd gotten better investment advice, but I've seen a lot. And one is in terms of running a fund, and that's not to get too big. And it's going to sound basic, but people make that mistake over and over again. So the original guy wrote my first book about, John Paulson. He made $20 billion over 2 years. On top of the world, super smart guy, but he'd never done anything historically until then. That was huge. And then subsequently, he grew his funds way too big. They got close to, I think, $40 billion. And the returns were never nearly as good. He was as smart as he was in 2005 and 2006 and 2007 when he was putting on this trade, the greatest trade, but he managed way too much money. And frankly, going back to Jim Simons, that's one of his secrets. So yeah, I have a lot of reasons why he's better than everybody else, but when we're talking about the medallion fund, the key medallion fund, he always returned all the profits every single year. They kept the fund flat for a while. It was 5 billion, then it was 10 billion. Every year, they could have raised much more, obviously, but they handed it back. So there's some I've seen over and over again. And everyone always kind of says, well, I'm going to be the one to be able to manage more money. And it never works out. So that's one. Listen, one thing I've learned from writing that book is you don't want to go up against Jim Simons and trade short term. These guys have more data, better data than anybody else, and it's short term oriented. So there is some lesson there of being more of a longer term investor, because Simons and Renaissance, they trade, their holding period is what they talk internally, they say moments to months, more moments than months. So we're talking really short-term oriented, but so they don't do longer-term trades. So to the extent that one can, there's some true advantage there. Those are kind of two lessons I've developed. Yeah. And frankly, this is just more of an observation. The biggest investors, the billionaires, the most successful traders are just as neurotic and insecure as the dentist trading his or her portfolio. You'd be surprised. I mean, you probably know as well as I do, but sitting across from some of these guys, they're checking their Bloomberg, not so much of they're checking their own portfolios, but they're checking out other people's portfolios too. And some of the best stories, my best stories are always a tip I get from some rival, some big name hedge fund manager. And then I'll go to like a conference and the hedge funds will be, why are you so negative on the industry, Greg? You're always writing in critical. Well, geez, you guys are giving me the calls. You're the ones tipping me off. So they're very, very competitive and neurotic. And even, going into their 40s, 50s, and 60s of age, guys like Leon Cooperman I write about and talk to. And Greg, you only write about me when I'm losing money. Why don't you write about me when I'm? So they're on edge and they care about their reputation. And you would think, they could buy islands. You would think they wouldn't care anymore, but they do.
And when they do buy an island, they get paranoid that their rival's going to buy a bigger island, or build something in front of their island or their property. It just carries on. The other question I wanted to ask was about productivity hacks. How you're able to do so much. You're writing books. Doing your day job. do you have a system of some kind, and you're interacting with lots of people all the time? Do you have a sort of note-taking system, or how do you sort of bring it all together?
The key to my productivity is having a deadline. So if I didn't have a deadline, I would be wasting time and enjoying myself. But for whatever reason, each of my books, maybe because I write about timely kind of things, I always have a tight deadline that I set with my publisher. Partly it's self-imposed, frankly. I could have taken more time with it, but I always figure I kind of want to turn it out. And at the Wall Street Journal, we have a deadline. So I have found that there are more hours in the day than you would think. Meaning that, like, when I was doing A Shot to Save the World, I was on average going to sleep at 3 a.m. And I was like taking showers at 2:30 a.m. before I was going to bed. And then you get 5 hours and you're not bad. And I keep the Jewish Sabbath. So for 25 hours, I have no electronics. I no TV, no nothing. And that forces that's been very helpful. When I was young, I resented it, and it really bothered me. My friends were enjoying themselves, and here I was kind of just at home with my family and just eating and reading and sleeping. And now I couldn't get more of it. It's a gift. And it's hard to impose that upon oneself if not for religious reasons. So, but to the extent one can develop at least for me, I can't speak for others. For me, it's been very helpful. I'm crazed most of the time, but then for 25 hours each week, I just shut things down. And that to me has been helpful.
Yeah, I think that's great. I mean, I think that everyone should sort of take some form of time out, like a digital Sabbath or something. It's really important to sort of detox oneself. So Greg, you've written lots of books, and presumably there must have been a whole bunch of books that have influenced you. Which books stand out in your mind that have influenced you the most?
Sure. So the classic financial narratives, Den of Thieves, Liar's Poker, Barbarians at the Gate. But there's one that I want to make a plug for that I loved, and I don't think enough people appreciate. It's called Indecent Exposure, and it's about Wall Street. It's about Hollywood, but a wonderful time when companies were getting bought and sold, and conglomerates were getting into Hollywood and their personalities. And that's by David McClintock, and I really enjoyed that. So those all helped me in terms of the narrative side of things. And then I'm just an avid newspaper reader, so I'll read everything, and I've always done so. And I believe in newspapers. I work for one, and there are a lot of great ones out there. So that's helped me as well.
That's great. And your book, A Shot to Save the World, I mean, how can people get hold of the book?
Should be available on Amazon, other kinds of online sources, your local bookstore potentially, or hopefully. And I love hearing from people. Some of my best sources are people that said, Greg, I read the article, I liked it, or I read your book and you missed this. I like the book, but I love that. So, constructive criticism is how I grow. And if your audience wants to reach out, I'd love to have a relationship and interaction.
Great. And what's the best way for people to connect to you?
Email at the Wall Street Journal, gregory.zuckerman@wsj.com. I'm also on Twitter. I'm also on LinkedIn. Those are the social media that I do most.
Okay, so I'll include a link to the book, the Amazon link. But if you can get an independent bookshop, buy a bookshop, not Amazon.
Definitely support your independent bookstore.
Otherwise, Amazon, and I'll include the contact links as well. But with that, thanks a lot, Greg. It was excellent speaking to you, and good luck with the book.
Thank you, and keep up the great work. I really enjoy the podcast, interesting guests and observations and conversations. So I look forward to keeping track of your work as well.
Great, thanks a lot.